Common mistakes that people make when painting trim. So we've all seen some really bad looking trim in our day, and chances are they committed at least a few of these painting sins. Okay, the first one is having a dusty, dirty work environment. So it really pays to keep things nice and tidy. Always vacuum out your corners. Having the little brush on a vacuum helps. And then at the end of that, what I always do is I have an old brush. So even after I've already vacuumed it, I'm still even gonna take my brush and go like this to get the extra dust off, making really sure that there's nothing built up in the corners. Like, how many times have you seen that somebody clearly painted over a whole bunch of dust and debris, and once it's in there, it's really hard to ever get out. So that's painting mistake number one, is having a dirty, dusty work environment. Okay, mistake number two is using the wrong type of filler. So the two types of filler that I use, I like to either use wood filler or, oh, you couldn't see that, wood filler. So it's just Elmer's wood filler. Or I like to use Dynapatch Pro. In this case, I use Dynapatch. So what you use is gonna depend a little bit on your sanding preferences. So notice that I didn't use Drydex for this product, and it's because I don't get good results when I use Drydex. I find it's too soft, and when I sand it, I tend to sand it out of the trim. The reason that is because the Drydex is way softer than wood. Whereas this stuff, the Dynapatch, is quite a lot harder. So when I'm sanding it, the surface and the filler tends to sand at a similar rate instead of having it sand out way too fast and be hollowed out. Okay, and painting sin number three, wrong method of sanding the filler. So you need to have the right method of sanding for the right type of filler. Now, because I like to use a harder type of filler, a sanding sponge is not gonna cut it. If you try and use a sanding sponge on stuff like wood filler or Dynapatch, it's not gonna sand it all off, and you might be left, instead of having it over sanded, it'll be under sanded. I also find that these don't actually sand down the old paint very well either. So if you're using something like Drydex, a sanding sponge might actually work okay because it's kind of intended for well, I use Drydex on walls with a sanding sponge, but actually I don't even use Drydex. I use regular drywall filler on walls. But anyways, all right, so my preferred method of sanding Dynapatch or wood filler is just with a folded up piece of sandpaper. And I can just put firm, even pressure with the sandpaper on there until I can see that it's been left perfectly flush with the woodwork. So that's what works best for me. My sanding method matches the filler I use. Okay, sin number four is gonna be using no caulking or the wrong caulking methods. So the wrong methods is just cutting way too big of a tip on it, letting lots of it overspill around the edges, just generally leaving big fat beads all over the place and having it not look very nice. And no caulking, I mean, maybe your woodwork is pretty tight, but I have noticed that you can use paint a little bit for filler, but for the most part, your lines are gonna look way cleaner with a real crisp bead of caulking in there. So that's number four that people do. Okay, mistake number five is not sanding the old woodwork. So yeah, you gotta sand old trim. You know, if it's brand new trim, you can get away without sanding the whole thing because the primer that's put on by the factory is made to accept paint well. However, if you're working on old trim, it needs to be sanded, and often it even needs to be primed as well. Otherwise, you're not gonna get proper adhesion from a water-based paint going onto the oil-based paint. That's actually a bit more of a complicated subject than I feel like getting into in this one, but the primary reason it fails is just lack of sanding. So when you sand, you create a keyed surface where the paint can grip. Another thing about sanding is as you're sanding old woodwork, you're getting rid of all the mistakes of the past painters. So that's why sanding the woodwork before painting is so important. Okay, number six is using poor quality paint or the wrong kind of paint. So one of the worst things I think that people can do is buy a really cheap semi-gloss, a really cheap water-based semi-gloss paint, and just paint it all over the place. Because that stuff doesn't level out, and if you roll it, you're gonna see that sort of gator skin. If you brush it, it's gonna be all ropey and you can see all the brush marks. So a cheap water-based paint, in my opinion, is no good for painting on trim. My personal favorite paint is the Benjamin Moore Advance, and I even choose Pearl. Right? So this stuff is a water-based alkyd. So it's actually still an oil-based paint that can be cleaned up by water. So I find it has better adhesion on old oil-based paints and has great adhesion over all latex paints. The other thing that this stuff does is it levels out so nicely. And I like pearl, that's my favorite one, because it has a little bit of sheen, but it's also flat enough that it doesn't show all the defects. So yeah, right there. You want to get into color even. I'm kind of old school and I like CC40, Cloud White. It's got a little bit of yellow and black in that white to make it kind of nice and creamy. And I find it makes all other colors around it just pop. And it just has a beautiful classic white trim look. So that's my favorite trim paint for you guys. I guess there's the other side. That's the French side though. Okay, you guys, number 7. So that's painting too thin or painting too thick. So it's called a coat of paint for a reason. It's not called a smear of paint. One thing that drives me crazy is when people roll paint on or brush it on, but they go way too light. So when you go too light, the paint doesn't have a chance to sit on there and level out. And it also makes your brush strokes tend to stand out a lot more because your paint's half kicked off as you're brushing into your old work. Or even worse, if you roll into your old work and it leaves that nasty stipple in there and it's not gonna level out. And painting too thick is just gonna lead to a whole lot of drips and sags. So that looks really bad after and is a lot of work to sand out later. Paint does sand, but freshly painted paint doesn't sand easily. And yeah, it's gonna be a lot of work if you paint it too thick. If it's dripping, you're putting on too much. And if it's kicking off before you can brush or roll back into it, you're not putting on enough. Okay, I think we are into number 8. And this one, actually, I didn't even write down, but a nice brush. So use a good brush. Don't use a cheap brush if you want to get good results. And that wasn't even actually the tip, but it's one I just realized I didn't have on my little list. But the tip is not lifting off into wet work. So as you're painting, there should be a sequence. So the first thing I did is I painted the edge, and then I painted the other side, and then I painted the top. But what I made sure of is I start in this direction, and then every time I lift off into the wet work, lift off into the wet work. So I'm not gonna be painting in this direction and then starting my brush stroke for the second pass in this direction, or you're gonna leave a nasty brush stroke. But when you lift off back into the old work, it tends to flatten out and lay down real nicely. So that's really important too. I can always see when people don't know how to use a brush and they've got weird lift-offs and stuff all over the place. So use a good brush and know how and when to lift off. Okay, number 9, you guys, and a lot of people might disagree with me, but not sanding between coats of paint. So I think it's super important to sand in between coats of paint. One is because it just knocks it down and helps it be a little bit flatter. So your next coat of paint lays down again a little bit flatter. 2, also if there's little crumbs or bits of debris, you're gonna be able to sand that stuff flat and it's not gonna be standing out. And 3, I think I'm on 3, it's also going to help with adhesion. So overall, you're gonna get a way nicer job if you're sanding in between your coats of paint. Just be sure to dust it off really well. Just a quick vacuum isn't quite good enough. You actually usually need to brush it off again to manually get all those teeny little bits out of there. Especially if it's latex paint, because I find the little clumps that sanding latex paint will leave sometimes will stick a little bit, and so you actually need to brush those off to get them out of there if you don't want to see them showing up again in your final coat of paint. Okay, and tip number 10 is not taping off the work properly or sequencing your work in the right order. Okay, so here's my ideal trim painting situation. Let's say I have a whole place and it's ready to paint. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to paint all of the trim. And I'm gonna get 2 coats on that trim, and I'm gonna make sure that it has about 2 or 3 days to cure before I get to doing the walls. So what I'm then going to do is I'm gonna take a nice tape, you know, one of these sharp lines or a frog tape or something, and at that point I'm gonna tape off along all the baseboards and all the casings. And I find that is, for me personally, the fastest way to get a really nice crisp line and have the whole job look pretty uniform. But the reason that that's not always practical is because you don't always have those couple of days for the trim to actually cure so that you can put the paint on it. I mean, put the tape on it. If you put the tape on it when the paint's a little too young, what's gonna happen is it's gonna pull off in a lot of spots, and that's gonna be really disappointing when you watch all the paint lifting off on the top of your baseboards and the side of your casings. Very disappointing. So on jobs where it's a little more rushed, say I have a room or two to get done in a day, in those cases I will paint the walls first, and then I have to take my time slow and steady cutting in the edge of the trim. And that's more time consuming for me, but I can do a passable job. One thing I rarely do is tape off the walls, and that's because the tape almost always pulls paint off where there's drywall mud. It tends to do pretty well where it's just over top of painted stuff, but if you've done a repair and then painted it and then try and tape over to protect it, you're gonna pull it right off. You can see right here I have a little spot because there was a little bit of damage where I put the tape on. Overall, it worked really well. I was actually surprised at how flawlessly the tape pulled off of the wall there. And the only reason I did that was because it was gonna be a lot of effort trying to paint this little 1/4 inch overhang. And I thought, you know what? I'd rather just tape off the wall and repair the damage because I have to paint these walls anyways. And this will be a super easy cut in. But yeah, it comes down to knowing what's your skill set. So for most homeowners and handymen that don't do this all the time, it's actually gonna be easier to paint all of your trim and tape off your trim, and that'll probably give you the best results. So yes, those are my 10 common trim painting mistakes. If you want to get nice, buttery smooth trim, try these methods. Hopefully you can maybe find out some of the things you've been doing wrong if your trim isn't coming out how you like it. Also, let me know in the comments what your methods are. I'm sure you have been this whole time. Anyways, I want to say thanks for watching. Hopefully your project's going well, and look forward to making the next video for you. Till the next one, you guys.